and welcome back to the World Explorers podcast, where it is the first of the month, and therefore we will be doing some world building basics. This is also our birthday month. It's both my birthday, Isaac's birthday, and the channel's birthday, all in February. So, as a special birthday present to Isaac, we're letting him do a theme that I'm not very familiar with and don't care for talking about much, but that he's really passionate about, just because, it's my birthday present to him, because I'm broke and can't send anything else.
Woohoo!
This is where you tell him what the theme is, because you're leaving the...
Okay. Yes. So, theme. World building weapons.
Duh.
Because weapons are awesome.
They're a thing.
Mostly magical weapons. Like medieval weapons are cool. Magical medieval weapons, even cooler. Modern day weapons such as tanks and guns and stuff, less cool, but yeah, okay, sure. It's just, that's been done to death. Anyway.
Well, of course it's been done to death. It's real. It's something you can, get a manual on and figure out.
Which is why it's been done to death. There's just too many of them. And it's like, oh look, I made something blow up. Well look, I've got this other bomb, and it just makes something blow up even bigger. Well, I got bullets. What do those bullets do? They shoot. Well, look at my gun. It just shoots faster. That's boring. That's very boring. Which is why we're world building weapons, magical weapons. Because normal weapons, pretty much all of the good normal medieval weapons have already been built. Because out of all the minds in the world in the medieval time, people have come up with pretty much every possible useful weapon.
Yeah, I won't disagree with that.
Yeah, I am not going to be able to come up with a new weapon just off the top of my head that would be, able to be built and forged in the medieval era that hasn't already been built.
Because that wouldn't be part of the medieval era if it hadn't been built in the medieval era.
Yeah.
Because that's how that works.
I'm just saying that if I were given their level of technology and everything, I could not outperform their weapon designs.
Yep.
Anyway, so world building weapons. We did an entire episode on a world building weapon thingy where we world built sun swords and moon armor, and we came up with different mechanics as to how they work.
Yeah.
So basically, what I want to do today is explain how exactly you might come to, how exactly one might world build these and design these new weapons. And it pretty much all starts off, what?
Oh, I was going to say, and then we would go into, different examples and methods and some tips and tricks and stuff.
Yeah, and it pretty much all has to start off with other world building. You cannot really world build a new weapon unless you have done world building before this. For example, if your world introduced a new material or a new element or something, one of the immediate things that you can go to help with world building is, how can this new item be used as a weapon? Because, if you introduce a new item, one of the things that mankind is going to try and do is turn it into a weapon, because we're really good at turning things into weapons.
So another thing you can do, you can actually reverse that, in that you can start with a weapon and then build a material out of that. So something you have to be very cautious and meticulous about is when you create a new weapon, explaining how that weapon works and where its source comes from. So if you have this cool idea for a weapon you really want to be in your world, you just have to keep in mind that people are going to ask, okay, where'd that come from, what material is it made out of, and all that stuff. And then you can actually get a lot of really cool world building elements, a lot more than you would think, out of just having this one weapon.
Yeah, for example, let's say you wanted to create a staff or club or something that, upon striking a target, causes it to start to float and gravity no longer affects it. So, affects the target. So maybe you can make it so that when it strikes again, that person falls. Now, what is causing that? Well, you could say it's a magical stone or crystal or something that was built into the head of the club or the hilt of the club or something that when this club strikes it or when the stone strikes it, it causes an object to start floating.
And then, you have the question like, okay, so where did that stone come from?
Exactly.
How was it made? Are there other stones like this with different abilities? And you get all these questions, and by answering them, you're able to really build out your world based around something as small as a weapon.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot of the ways that Casey and I world build is I will usually start with start with a concept or an idea, and then try and turn that into something else like a weapon. Like I'll start with basic world building elements, turn into something else like a weapon, and then bring culture out of that, or things along those lines. Whereas Casey generally does the reverse of everything I do,
Yep.
where she will be more like, here's what the culture is like, and then here's why the culture is like that. Here's what the weapon is like, and then here's why the weapon is like that.
Yeah. Two very different
Now, would you
methods.
say that's accurate?
Yeah, I would say that's very accurate. I tend to start with the people, the item, the. I like to start small and then really expand, and you like to start big and then shrink down, which
Yeah,
are both very valid ways of world building, and they're very different. But at the same time, if you listen to all our other podcasts, you get to the same place. Like you
pretty
start in
much.
different areas, and then we end up meeting in the middle, and we're all good.
Yeah, like with this the example of the weapons, where usually I always go for elements and objects and magic systems stuff first, weapons second, because I'm generally world building a bunch of stuff, and then I say, okay, well, how would people turn this thing I've now added into a weapon? And then if you do start going the reverse and you say, weapon, object, and then object. For example, you say anti-gravity club and then stone or crystal. Well, now you got to start wondering, is this the only way that people would start using a crystal or a stone like this? What other things would they use it? Because one, they wouldn't just use it in weapons; they would start using it in other things. And now you got to start world building other stuff, because once you have anti-gravity, well, that would probably have a massive effect on things such as transportation of goods. Like rather than hauling a bunch of heavy stuff by a wagon or multiple wagons, you could have like one horse drawing thousands of different items because none of them are affected by gravity.
But I also feel like you'll have
And then
that
for bigger,
you'll have that that's going to happen anyways. So even if you do have like this cool world building element and then you make a weapon out of it, there's always a lot of backpedaling in writing, especially if you end up creating something new or adding in elements. You then have to go back and say, okay, so how does this affect like everything else? Because I know in one of the stories I wrote, I had this element of mine which I added in later, and then once I added it in, I'm like, oh wait, this kind of changes everything, and I had to go back through the entire story and rework this element into the story. And that's okay. If you feel like this element is needed and important, then you should be willing to put in the effort to rewrite it in, cuz you don't want to make the mistake of introducing this really powerful weapon and then never talking about how it affected the world, cuz that doesn't make sense, cuz everything affects everything and story should be aware of that.
yes, one of the best ways to get around this problem is really if you don't want to go into a whole bunch of massive world building, is make the item limited. Make it so that maybe it's not a common thing. This, like for example, this anti gravity stone, uh, it's not easily available to everybody, so it doesn't affect transportation. It's like every once in a while there will be one out of maybe 10,000 people that obtain one, and so that one person is using it for his own good or his own services. Maybe he's using it to create a weapon. Maybe he plans on selling it. Maybe there's a million different things that people will do with it.
I
and
mean,
it all depends on the person's personal situations and desires.
and I feel like a good example of this is actually D&D, is that there's a lot of unique weapons in D&D that there's only one of, and you have to like hunt it down and look for it and make effort to get it. And it always has like this complex backstory of how it was created and why there's only one. Either it was created by a god or it was used for like this pre-time war between different gods and men. And so there's only that one, and it was only used for a weapon because of that reason. And you now have to go and hunt down this one thing and hope it helps you in your own path and journey. And I know I find it interesting how like how many people are actually against like using D&D tricks in their writing, and I think that's really stupid because I think D&D is like a great writing tool and a good thing to pull sources of, because they do things like species and weapons and cultures so stinking well, and they do it at a mass and with different characters, and it's very complex. So, and I think one of the things they do exceptionally well is their weapon system. I think it's really cool and a really good source of inspiration for if you're building weapons of your own, especially if you want to make them like one of a kind, unique ones.
Okay, so I think we are drifting a little bit further away from world building weapons specifically, and just world building magical items in general. Which we have a totally different world building basics episode for that.
Yeah.
Uh, and so back to weapons specifically. Uh, when you're looking at weapons and how they would be utilized in combat, you want to try and push these new items and weapons to their fullest extent. Because what a lot of people fail to do is they will introduce a new item and they will fail to realize this item can be used as a weapon in their writing, like a very powerful weapon. And then then there will be people who do realize this can be used as a weapon, but they don't realize to what extent they could use this thing as a weapon. For example, let's take teleportation, or actually better yet, opening portals as a weapon. Portals would be some of the most devastating weapons ever, especially when implemented on the battlefield. For example, let's say you got two armies heading towards each other. Rather than them slowly pushing at each other and eating through each other, you could have half of your army go to the other side via a portal and outflank the other army. So you've now surrounded the entire army just by opening a portal. You could open a portal underneath your opponents and have them fall in, and then you could drop them from the sky on top of each other, or over a lake, or just from really high so they hit the ground hard. You could roll a boulder through a portal and then have it fall out of a portal onto your enemies. There's a lot of different ways that portals can be used. Sometimes, depending on how your world building works, you can open a portal, have somebody go halfway through it, close it, and then slice them in half. Doctor Strange does this, but not to nearly the extent that I think they could have.
And
This is what I'm saying, where a lot of people fail to realize just how incredibly powerful simple things like portals would actually be.
which I think also
And
brings
so,
up another really important point with weapons, which is putting limits on them and making them clear. So say you don't want portals to be used in that way, you could say like the only way a portal really works is if someone from their free will and the items they're holding goes through. So you can't just send items in, and they have to be brought in with a person, and that person has to be going through the portal via their own free will. Which means you can use like the flanking maneuver is a valid thing you can do, but you couldn't do something like roll the boulder or drop these guys into from different places and teleport them about. Or there's, you can have limitations in how big it can be or who can cast it is another really good limitation. If you don't have access to someone who can create the portals, then obviously you're not going to have the portals. So there are ways where you can limit your weapons so that way you don't like dominate every battle, because no story is fun if your hero walks in, presses a button, kills everyone, and then goes home and like eats a piece of cake in celebration, goes to bed, and that's the end of the story. Like no one
yeah,
wants to read that. So limitations is a good way to give your characters more challenge and actually make your story worth reading.
Yeah, briefly going back to our magic systems world building basics episode, uh, we were talking about how when you're creating a magic system, a good way to create an interesting magic system is add a but to your magic. For example, saying you can fly is one thing. Oh yeah, that's really cool. That's already nice on its own. Not the most interesting, but then it changes if I say you can fly, but only when both of your parents are asleep.
Yeah.
And then suddenly that new limitation, you're like, oh, well, now what do you do? Do you move to a different part of the world, like where time zones are completely off, like, or the other side of the world, where so that you're now awake when they're sleeping? What happens if like you're flying through the sky and then suddenly they wake up? Do you just never fly that high? Because that would be dangerous.
Does killing them
What
allow you to fly permanently? And is that an option that you are willing to try?
Yeah, like there's a lot of different ways that you could take this, and this is kind of a silly example, but it still gets the point across. Where if you add a limitation or a necessity or requirement for the magic system to work, you can now start using it in creative ways.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, where it might not, where and this can also allow you to use it in some instances, but then there are other instances where you do not want your characters to be able to use the magic system because it would solve the problem too easily. Well, you put a limitation on it. Don't put it right then and there because then it feels like it comes out of nowhere. But if you could put the limitation on earlier and make it clear that's the limitation, well, now people they will be like, oh, well, they can't use the magic system, so how are they going to get past this this challenge? Because they can't just zap it gone.
And bringing that back
And this applies to weapons.
yeah, bringing it back to weapons a bit more closely. One way they do this is actually to give weapons faults, and like so disabilities, I guess is another word of it. So, for example, you could have like a fire sword, but the fire sword needs to be recharged, which is something that we did in our Sun and Moon one, where you had to kind of reforge the fire sword in order to keep it active and going. Or you could have that like it has certain weaknesses, so you know if you attack this certain thing with this weapon, it will automatically break, so you can no longer use the weapon against this. And Isaac also brings up a really good point. It tends to flow better if you establish it really early on. It's for one, it makes people feel really smart when they catch. They're like, "Oh yeah, you established that earlier. I remember that," and they feel really smart. Other than just springing it like you have this mission, and then all of a sudden it's like, "But oh no, this is a no magic zone, so they can no longer use their magical weapons because magic doesn't work here." But and you just
Yeah.
have people like, "Oh wow, that's so clever. You really got us there," and then they close the book and they walk away.
The no magic zone is actually interesting, real quick, because there is one really easy way to make a convincing no magic zone, and it's make a no weapons zone. Like you are not allowed to bring your weapons into this bar, or whatever, and so they have to leave their weapons at the door or leave it with a person standing at the door who will lock them up, and then they're allowed in. Because this guy has had too many people go in and destroy his chairs and his tables and stuff, uh, who got too drunk and then started swinging their swords about. And so now you've got a very convincing, like, this feels like a real thing that would actually happen, where they aren't allowed to have their weapons. And this also hints to the reader. It doesn't feel out of nowhere or feel forced. This just hints to the reader, or rather, what the reader's going to feel is, oh, they do not have their weapons. This means that they are likely going to run into some sort of trouble where they need them, and they are going to need to find a way out of it. I cannot wait to see how they do that, or what the problem is that they're going to have to overcome.
Yeah, and I think the reason
Because
why this method works so surprisingly well is that it's something that we're very familiar with. Like, this is something that happens to us. We have a bunch of no weapon zones, IRL, like airplanes or official buildings or schools and stuff where you can't bring stuff like that unless you're like an officer or you have a paperwork that allows you to gives you special exceptions. So this is something that's very real and to us, and therefore we latch onto it really easily. So while we have like these magical worlds and these magical weapons, that doesn't mean you can't use real world issues and problems to help a reader kind of familiarize themselves and latch onto a world. And a big way to do that is like no weapon rules like are allowed here, because that is something we see a lot.
Yeah, that's a really easy way to just make a world more immersive. Like you can have a totally wild, crazy world with a whole bunch of magic system rules and world building and creatures and everything, but you can put in familiar uh, moments and scenarios, and like this one, like a no weapon zone. That's a very real thing that real people do, and you could see people in this fantasy world having it as well.
Yeah,
Now, this doesn't mean that you should put anything of familiarity in there. For example, I don't expect to see a school bus driving down the street in Lord of the Rings. Like, no.
yeah, but you
Don't
wouldn't
do that.
you
Like,
wouldn't
it
be
wouldn't fit. It
surprised
needs to
though
fit.
if you see a herd of children being head to a school in whatever magical like area they are at and being taught education. Like that wouldn't surprise you. It's the school bus that's out of place.
Yeah, you need. Yeah, you need to make it fit in the world, of course.
Yeah.
I don't know if this one really needed to be mentioned. Anyway, weapons. So, another way that you can world build weapons and make them feel more real, going back to those limitations, uh, you want to give them certain properties. And very often these properties can also come with limitations depending on what you're doing, how you're doing. Uh, if for example, our we world built sun swords, and these sun swords could cut through essentially anything. That was like their main property. But we built a mirrored item, which was moon armor, which was like a solid object that the sun swords could not cut through. And so this allowed us to have. I lost my thought where I was going with this.
It allows them to have it creates for themselves a limitation that's not necessarily expected by the weapon. So like the weapon itself doesn't need to have the limitation. It could be something else in the world that gives it its limitation instead. So the moon armor isn't like a fault of the sun sword. Like the sun swords couldn't expect this moon armor to exist, but now it does, and it adds a limitation, but it also adds a new world element, and it itself has to be created and stuff. So, and you can then world build off of that.
Yeah, and from those limitations, you now have to wonder how are people going to adapt to these new limitations and even the new abilities of the Sun Sword. For example, people say, "I have a Sun Sword." Well, now people are going to say, "Oh, well, I counter with Moon Armor or Moon Shield," and then they'll say, "Oh, well, now my Sun Sword doesn't work, so I'll need to find some other way to counter the Moon Shield." Well, how about the moon? Well, for us, what we did was we made the Moon Armor and Moon material pretty delicate in comparison to things like wood and metal. So they'll say, "Oh, well, I'll just get like a hammer or a mace and destroy your shield. Now I can go and hit you with my sun sword." And so it's like, "Oh, well, how do they counter?" Well, let's make layered shields. Let's have a layer of wood, and then underneath that, a layer of moon. This way, if you hit it with the hammer, the moon is protected by the wood. Hit it with the sun sword, well, it's going to cut through the metal or the wood, but then it's going to be stopped by the moon armor. And so that's another thing you got to keep in mind is once you introduce a new weapon, people aren't going to sit back and be like, "Oh my gosh, he's got a new weapon, he's too powerful, we can't do anything." They're going to say, "No, how can we fight this thing? Like, what is its abilities and what is its strengths? How are they planning on attacking us, and how can we defend against that?"
Yeah, to
For example,
simplify, it's pretty much to simplify what you're saying is you can't for every weapon there's going to be a way to stop it. Or people are going to be actively coming up with it. That might be the entire story, like Star Wars and destroying the Death Star. This giant weapon came off. People are like, "Well, we're not gonna let that thing blow up planets." So they found a way to stop it, and then they did. And then they made the same mistake like 3 more times, but that's not the point. Uh,
Yeah, at that point, what should have happened was the Empire should have said, "Oh, we see what we did wrong. Let's
Let's,
fix the hole in the ship
yeah,
so
you
that
think.
they don't blow it up again."
Yeah, and as you can
And
see,
then,
people,
even many years later,
no.
like everybody knows how the Death Star blew up. We know that everybody knows how the Death Star blew up by this time in in Episode 7, and then they're like, "Let's not learn from our mistakes and just make a bigger Death Star."
And that is very unrealistic, and all of us looked at that and said, really? And instantly lost interest in like that section of the movie, and it downgraded its value and stuff as we're like, another one? There are other things
Yeah,
you can do.
like maybe in in with the first and second Death Star, they just weren't aware of uh their own weakness, because on the first one it blew up too fast, too instantly, and they don't know what happened because everybody's dead who
Mm-hmm.
was there to possibly have witnessed it. And the only ones who know are the rebels who have the plans and were told about this specific weakness to it by a rebel who designed it. So maybe the Empire doesn't even know about this weakness. However, you would expect some engineers to catch it, but whatever. I'll let it slide because it's still a good movie.
Yeah,
um,
but
and this is why they wouldn't patch it up on the second one, because they just aren't aware of it.
eventually, if your characters aren't like learning and adapting, they lose like relatability for one thing, because we know that we ourselves would try to adapt and grow and learn from things like this, and they no longer become like interesting villains, or like they lose a lot of their threateningness or that they have, because you're like, oh, I'll just keep doing the same thing I'm doing, and you'll just be defeated constantly. It's kind of why a reason why I don't care for like Peter Pan and Captain Hook from the original stories, because it's always just the same thing. Like Captain Hook captures someone, and then Peter Pan comes in and taunts and teases the living daylights out of him. The crocodile shows up, and then that's the end of their fight, and it's just that on constant repeat. And it gets really boring because neither of them are like really developed. Captain Hook has some development where he's trying new things, and that's why I prefer him over Peter Pan. That and many other reasons. But at the same time, when you get the same fights over and over, it gets boring fast. So you want to figure out new ways to make your weapons interesting, and a good way to do that is watching characters learn to use weapons in different ways and to adapt and like improve their skill and stuff, because growth is a big part of any story, and so it should be something involved in weapon mastery.
Yeah, I can't believe I'm actually going to be using this as a positive example, but Power Rangers.
Oh, great.
I don't remember which series this was, but I remember many years ago. I think it was just a samurai
Oh, I don't
series.
know.
There was a villain who had a very hard shell. I remember, and this shell was basically indestructible. And I think what he did was he would like roll towards people at high speeds and just knock them over, I guess.
Okay.
And so they're like, "Oh no, we can't break past his shield. What do we do?" And then now that the bad guys have this new, it's not a weapon. It's somewhere between weapon and armor, but it still works for this example. They have this new weapon, and they're like, "How do we counter it?" And so, through a little bit of science, they decided. I can't remember. I think it's like they heat it up. I can't remember how this works. They either heat it up fast and then freeze it, or they freeze it really quickly and then heat it up. Which order is it again that would break this? I don't
It's
know, but it causes it to expand and break.
Oh, in which case I think you so what you do is you turn it into gas, and then that gas expands everywhere, and then you freeze it really fast, and it's that hard, so it's heat and then freeze.
Okay.
Just
So yeah,
to
they heat
clarify
him
that.
up really a whole bunch, and then they freeze him, and then that destroys his shell, and then they're able to beat him. That's the sort of thing where they don't just sit by and say, "Oh no, we can't defeat this enemy because he's too strong," and it's not like they just get a. It's not like they are just magically gifted a new weapon to destroy it. No, they start thinking, what are the methods that we can use that we already have available to us to defeat it? Rather than, we'll go and forge our own shield, or make an even better shield, because that's not creative, that's not interesting, and it feels a little bit like a Deus Ex device, where it's just like, oh, they have a item we can't beat. Well, here's a bigger item, or better item, sharper item, whatever.
It's kind of
But
like
this way, it's like, no, they're using basic science and psych here. It's like, and the abilities that they already have to just freeze and heat him up and done. Like, he's defeated.
it's kind of like not to hit too close to home, but and use near a real life example, but why not? Our world's tendency to fight a bomb with a bigger bomb, like it's not
Yeah,
gonna stop a bomb. It's just creating a bigger bomb, and maybe switching priorities around might be smarter, like how to stop bombs rather than how to make the next biggest one. That's just my
yeah.
personal opinion,
That's
but
why we have anti-aircraft
yeah,
turrets. Like, we have
or
actually
we're
done sort of thing.
yeah,
Where
or
we
working on
don't just sit
shields and
by and
stuff.
let ourselves get bombed, and we don't
Like
just sit by and build more bombs and blow up the enemy. We say, how are we going to stop those bombs? Well, anti-aircraft turrets. Like,
yeah.
anti-aircraft guns, those will take down the bombs before they reach us.
Mhm.
And then people will say, oh, well, how do we take out the anti-aircraft turrets? Well, maybe with foot soldiers. Oh, well, how do we take out the foot soldiers? Oh, well, what if we had some turrets on the ground, or some tanks, machine guns, our own foot soldiers? Well, how do we take those out? And so
War is
it's a lot of back
complicated.
and forth.
War is very complicated. If anything, like world building wars and battles is like an episode of itself that we could give a go if people show interest and want to like hear about more world building, like battles and wars and stuff. That could be fun. But this is weapons is like a big enough topic just to focus on that instead. But wars are
Yeah.
complicated. Weapons make them even more complicated, and you gotta keep always changing and developing. I think, but at the same time, there is a point where you're doing it too fast for readers. I think my example for this would be Ninjago. So Ninjago started out as a really cool series where you had these elementals, kinda, and you follow them, and they're at first they're developing their powers and unlocking new abilities, and it makes sense, and you're following it really easily, and then at some point they like go on steroids, and they're constantly losing powers, gaining new ones, and introducing new powers and new abilities. All of a sudden, there's this entire society of people who have elemental abilities, and you're just sitting there like going, and this was hidden by them for like 8 years, and nobody knew about this? I don't care if they were trapped on an island. No one told these four people that, hey, you're not alone. Oh, it's actually genetic. It's passed on from like parent to child. And I'm like, then how the robot get it? I'm confused. So, if you want, moving too fast can quickly become a problem, and you do need to be careful about that. You gotta make it make sense and show the path and guide people through it, because if suddenly, like, new abilities are unlocking constantly like this, and it's either not earned or not explained properly, you're gonna lose your readers, and you're gonna lose them fast. Kind of like me, who doesn't watch Ninjago anymore, because I was just like,
Uh,
eh.
okay, so for an example of somebody who actually did this right, let's look at Avatar, because Avatar is the pinnacle of writing.
Yeah.
So, Toph and metal bending. Now, metal bending is a thing where it makes sense as to why Toph is the first one to have discovered it. Because she discovered it out of desperation and through her blindness and her different method of earth bending, where she repeatedly punches the metal for hours until she eventually realizes that and feels, and since it's a tiny bits of metal or tiny bits of earth within the metal, she's then able to bend it. So it makes sense that nobody was able to metal bend before, but then once she starts metal bending, she starts turning it into a weapon and starts finding multiple uses of how to turn this into a weapon. And this doesn't come out of nowhere. It's this one new ability that was just introduced. It's explained why it hasn't been introduced in the past, why nobody else has used this, why she's the only one. And then the different ways that she is using it aren't really expanding in a way that you can't follow, because it's basically just normal earth bending, but with metal. And so she'll do things like she'll rip the plating off the side of a ship and start using it as armor. Or in The Legend of Korra, they started making these whips and handcuffs out of metal to hold earthbenders.
And actually, to even go beyond that, the fact that she did that was almost hinted, like little seeds of it were already planted, especially when you think about waterbenders and the fact that, despite it being a very forbidden art, they could bloodbend. Like, that was a thing super powerful waterbenders who were very corrupted and not and creepy could do. They could find water inside of people and manipulate them in that way. So if a waterbender can find water in blood and bend it, then it's not that far fetched for an earthbender to be able to find earth in metal and bend that. So there's even like little seeds like that where you make connections and people get all excited because you seem a little nerdy when you make those connections and stuff that you can kind of thread through.
Although I'm pretty sure the metal bending came before the blood bending.
Did it? I don't think so. I thought the blood bending came first.
They were in the Fire Nation when she started blood bending.
No, they weren't.
Which was season 3.
No, they weren't. No, I thought
the
blood
metal
bending. No, which came first? Blood bending or metal bending? Oh, no, I guess it did come first.
In metal, yep. I just remember them being
yeah,
in the Fire Nation.
Yeah, it's a whole season before.
Okay. Yeah, there's an example of this done right, where you're not overwhelming the audience with all these new abilities. When you introduce things like blood bending and metal bending, they are spaced out from each other, and it's explained why they are able to do these things and why they haven't been done before. And it's simple and easy to understand why they work, because they are expansions of the previous abilities. It's not just, this character can throw fireballs, and then one day, out of nowhere, it's now this character can also grow plants out of the ground and control them, and then also shoot lightning and shoot water balls, and also open up holes in the ground, and also throw tornadoes, and also bring meteorites down from the sky, and also
we get it.
Snake.
We get it.
All the different abilities.
Yeah. And also, this also gives if you want to, like, limit a weapon's ability, something that blood bending is a good example of is you can also have people unwilling to use different aspects of their weapon. So, like, Katara is unwilling to bloodbend for very obvious reasons. Another thing, like, I always wondered, like, something airbenders could do that I'm surprised they never do is, like, suffocate people. Just be like, we're done here, and just, they're done. And I'm like,
that was done in Legend of Korra.
Yeah, but I'm like, but of course Aang wouldn't do that, because he doesn't really want to actually hurt people. He just wants to get out of the situation, and he uses his airbending to, like, avoid and kind of peacefully. He has a very fight defensively.
Pacifist.
Yeah, if he can avoid killing them, he's going to, and therefore he wouldn't use just walk onto, because it'd be so easy to finish these fights if Aang just went on the airship and, like, waved his hands around and just everyone was dead because they were all suffocated, and then flew off and said, well, that was easy, who wants lunch? But that's not something he's going to do, because character wise, for one, he's a kid, for two, that's a really dark method that he would never do. And it's the same with Katara and bloodbending. So that's another really good method to limit a weapon, is to actually... And it also gives a lot of good questions and moral implications to people, like, dealing with weapons. Like, if you have a weapon that's possessed by a demon and it comes into the hands of someone who is very against that, who maybe has, like, a lot of religious ideas or something, you suddenly have this conflict of this person needs this weapon to complete a task, but at the same time this person really doesn't want to use the weapon because it goes against everything they believe in.
And something else that you could, that's really interesting, that you can take for character development from this, and going back to Katara and bloodbending as an example, Katara bloodbends when she needs to save her friends from, what's her name, Hama?
I have no clue, she's creepy.
I don't know, the puppet master.
Yeah.
She needs to save her friends from her, and she doesn't want to bloodbend, but she does to save them, and then from that point on, she decides she's never going to bloodbend again.
She does it one other time, yeah.
Yeah, that's where I'm getting there.
Okay.
But then, in the episode, The Southern Raiders, possibly, like, it's one of the greatest episodes in the entire series. Like, in that episode, she bloodbends. and it's out of just pure hatred and anger. And this is Katara. She's a very loving, kind character, and she had in the first time she had bloodbend, she had broke down in tears. So for her to be so violently and aggressively using this ability that she had decided she would never use again to take control of this person and start bloodbending him, it sends a serious message character-wise. Like, you don't. It's just the last thing you would expect her to do, and it just
You're
even
not
though
surprised by it.
yeah,
Like, this is the point where you sit there like, yeah, this is where she does this. This makes sense. She needs to use this now. Like for
yeah,
her character, like it made sense for the story that they were telling and her character. Like no one is surprised she does it. We're all shocked, but at the same time, in the back of we head, we saw this coming. That doesn't mean we're not
I
shocked
mean,
by it.
I didn't see the bloodbending coming. I didn't expect her to. Like when I started doing that, I'm like, whoa, this is serious. Because again, she broke down in tears the first time she did it,
Yeah.
like, and never wanted to do it again. Like she did not want. She, above all else, did not want to be a bloodbender. But then, because it was just so horrible, and she didn't like the feeling of doing it. But then when she finds this guy that she thinks killed her mother, she has no problem just immediately using it.
Yeah, but I do think it's time for us to start wrapping up weapons. I think we've made some progress talking about it, like how you might get started, moral implications of it, how to limit your weapons, some
And just how
tips.
people would react to them. Like I
Yeah,
think that's the main thing that a lot of people fail to realize is the two main things people fail to realize is when you're world building weapons, what are the actual implications and to what extremes would people take it? And two, how would people counter the weapon?
yeah.
Those are the two things that a lot of people seem to forget when world building.
You're not just building a weapon. You're building a people group, and people react, and you can't forget that. Like when you're telling a story, things happen in the story, and people grow and develop and change, and your weapons have to do the same. And I think that's a good place to end this. So we're gonna end up saying goodbye here. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. We'll be back next month with another world building basics, but we will be back next week with more world exploring. So hopefully you'll join us for that. But until then, we'll talk to you guys later. Bye.
Goodbye, all. What's
And
a song
no,
about
we don't do
weapons?
songs for world building basics. Remember?
Oh,
See
okay.
you again.
Bye. Bye. Bye.